Early spring came late to the river valley in 1893. Snow still clung to the shaded ground, and the soil held water from months of slow thaw. At the far edge of the settlement, where the land dipped gently toward the river, a small cabin stood alone. It belonged to Thomas Hale, 19 years old, newly settled and already regarded with mild skepticism by those who had lived there longer. If you found this story of patience and observation compelling, please like, share, and subscribe to follow more historical survival accounts. How would you have prepared for a flood with nothing but tools from your own cabin? Each morning, Thomas worked with a shovel, cutting a narrow trench around the perimeter of his cabin. The line followed no fence and marked no boundary. It circled the structure at an even distance, broken only where the ground hardened or stones resisted the blade. He worked steadily, without haste, and without explaining himself. Men passing along the track slowed to watch. One remarked that water had never reached that high. Another laughed quietly and said the boy was wasting strength better spent reinforcing the roof. Their words carried no cruelty, only certainty. The river had always risen and fallen within its banks. Spring floods were spoken of elsewhere, not here. Thomas did not respond. He adjusted the trench's depth where the ground sloped, tamped the loose soil with his boot, and moved on. By midday, his hands were raw and his shoulders stiff. He paused only to drink from a tin cup and to study the land, watching how meltwater threaded through the grass and disappeared. The older settlers trusted memory. They spoke of decades without loss, of cabins that had endured worse winters than this one. The valley, they said, protected itself. Thomas listened when spoken to, nodded when required, and returned to his work. Clouds gathered more often than they had in previous springs. Snow melted faster in the hills, feeding unseen channels beneath the surface. The river darkened with silt and pressed wider against its banks, though still calmly, still without alarm. To most, it was a passing detail. A boy asked Thomas why he was digging. Thomas answered only that water moved where it was allowed to move. The reply earned another laugh from a nearby porch. For those watching, the trench seemed an answer to a problem that did not exist. It looked narrow, shallow, and fragile against the land's breadth. No one stopped him, but no one joined him either. If this account has been useful so far, consider subscribing for more documented survival histories, or sharing it with someone interested in how people once endured difficult seasons. By the end of the week, the trench formed a continuous line. Rain began that night, light but steady, soaking the loosened soil. Thomas rose once to check the flow, then returned inside. Beyond his cabin, the valley waited, holding more water than it had in years. The rain did not stop after that first night. It settled into the valley with a steady patience, falling in thin sheets that darkened the soil and softened the paths between cabins. By the third day, the sound of water on wood had become a constant feature of morning and evening alike. The river itself remained calm, moving wide and slow, giving no sign of urgency. It was during one of these damp mornings that the settlement's older authority figure came to see what Thomas Hale was doing. He had lived beside the river for most of his life and was regarded as a man whose judgment rested on long experience rather than haste. He stood at the edge of the trench, boots sinking slightly into the wet ground, and studied the line Thomas had cut. "You won't hold the river back with that," he said, not unkindly. "It's always stayed where it belongs." Two other men, both long-settled farmers, nodded in agreement. One spoke of a spring 20 years earlier when the snowmelt had been heavier than this. Another recalled a season of constant rain that had passed without damage. Their confidence rested on repetition. The river had risen before, and it had always returned to its course. If this historical account interests you, please like, share, and subscribe for more stories from the frontier. Thomas listened while continuing to work. He lifted mud from the trench and set it aside, shaping the edge so water would not fall back in. When the shovel struck stone, he adjusted the line rather than forcing it. He did not argue with the men, nor did he defend his reasoning. Rainwater pooled briefly in the trench before finding its way along the shallow channel. Thomas watched it move, testing the slope with his hand. The ground around the cabin grew darker each day, holding moisture longer than it had at the season's start. The older man shook his head once and turned away. "You'll tire yourself before planting," he said, as if offering advice. The others followed, satisfied that nothing more needed to be said. As they left, the river continued its slow movement, pressing against grass that bent but did not break. The surface carried branches and silt from upstream, signs of activity beyond the valley, though few took notice. If this record of early frontier decisions is of value, a quiet subscription or share helps preserve more accounts like it. By the end of the week, rainfall increased. The trench filled more quickly now, the water running along its length instead of soaking directly into the ground near the cabin's walls. Thomas deepened several sections, working through cold mornings with stiff hands and measured movements. He ate little during the day and rested only when the light failed. Those who passed by still trusted the river. They spoke of it as something familiar, governed by habits that did not change without warning. The sound of digging became part of the background, easily ignored. At night, water moved beneath the surface, unseen. The soil loosened further, and the river crept outward by inches, pressing quietly into land that had not yet realized it was being tested. As the days passed, the rain was joined by meltwater descending from the higher elevations beyond the valley. Snow that had lingered late on the shaded slopes began to release itself in steady measure, feeding narrow channels that ran unseen beneath the ground. The surface appeared unchanged in places, but footsteps sank deeper, and fence posts leaned slightly where the earth no longer held firm. Thomas Hale noticed these changes early. Water seeped into the trench more quickly now, arriving not only from rainfall but from below. He knelt at several points along the channel, running his fingers through the cold flow to feel its direction. Where the current slowed, he deepened the cut. Where it rushed too fast, he eased the slope to prevent collapse. The work took time and care, and his hands bore the marks of it. Others in the settlement paid little attention. Planting season was approaching, and most concern remained fixed on fields rather than foundations. The river still moved quietly within its widened course, giving no cause for alarm. Its surface reflected the low sky, dull and uninterrupted. One afternoon, an elderly woman made her way slowly toward Thomas's cabin. She had lived in the valley longer than most, and walked with the help of a worn stick. She stopped at the edge of the trench and watched the water move through it for a long moment before speaking. "There was a spring once," she said, her voice low and even, "when the ground gave way before the river did." She did not name the year. Few would have remembered it clearly. She only said that water had come from places no one had expected. Thomas acknowledged her words with a nod and returned to his work. He adjusted the trench near the cabin's corner, carving a slight curve so the flow would turn away rather than strike the wall directly. The elderly woman remained a while longer, then moved on, leaving no further comment. The ground continued to soften. Grass along the lower stretches of the valley flattened under its own weight, roots loosened by constant moisture. Small rivulets appeared after each rain, vanishing by morning but leaving the soil darker than before. Beneath the surface, water pressed outward, testing the land's memory of dryness. Thomas worked from early light until dusk. He ate standing, resting the shovel against his shoulder, and drank sparingly. When his strength faded, he slowed rather than stopped, shaping the trench in shorter movements. The channel now carried water steadily, its sides scarred by use but holding. Pause for a moment, and if you value these lessons from history, like, share, and subscribe for further narratives. Those who passed by still regarded the work as unnecessary. One remarked that the river had yet to cross the lower path. Another said the old woman had always been given to worrying. No one altered their routines. At night, the sound of water changed. It no longer fell only from above, but seemed to move through the earth itself, a muted shifting beneath the cabin floor. Thomas lay awake, listening, measuring the sound against the trench's course in his mind. By the end of the week, the unseen channels beneath the valley floor were full. The land absorbed no more than it could bear, and excess water began to seek release. The trench carried its share away from the cabin, quiet and unremarked, as the river prepared to test the valley more directly. The rain settled into a pattern that no longer suggested passing weather. It fell through the day and continued through the night, not in bursts, but in a steady descent that left little time for the ground to recover. Low clouds pressed close to the valley, holding the moisture in place. Paths between cabins softened, then disappeared, their outlines replaced by shallow water and churned earth. The river did not surge or roar. Instead, it widened, its edges blurred as water pressed outward into grass and field, claiming ground slowly and without resistance. Fence posts stood deeper in the current each morning. The lowest footbridges were submerged not by force, but by patience. Where dry soil had once absorbed overflow, it now reflected the sky. Thomas Hale watched these changes from the edge of his clearing. His dog, a lean animal accustomed to roaming the valley, refused to cross certain patches of ground, circling instead with lowered head and cautious steps. It tested the earth with its weight, then retreated, unsettled by the shifting firmness beneath its paws. Along the trench, water now moved continuously. The channel carried runoff away from the cabin, its surface broken by leaves and fine debris washed down from higher ground. Thomas cleared blockages as they formed, widening several narrow points to prevent overflow. The work left his boots soaked and his legs heavy with mud. Across the settlement, people took notice, though no clear response followed. Some moved tools and supplies to higher shelves. Others watched the river from doorways, marking its progress against familiar landmarks. Conversation turned cautious, but still relied on comparison. The water had risen before, they said. It always slowed. Fields nearest the river lay under a thin sheet of water. Seed sacks remained unopened, waiting for ground that no longer felt certain. Livestock were led to slightly higher ground, though no one spoke of moving cabins or dismantling structures. The valley had not yet demanded that kind of decision. The older authority figure walked the riverbank one afternoon, measuring its spread with his eyes. He said little. The water lapped quietly at his boots, leaving no clear line to mark where the river ended and the land began. When he returned home, he closed his door against the rain and waited. Thomas continued his work in silence. He reshaped the trench where the flow had begun to cut too sharply, reinforcing the sides with packed soil and stone. The dog remained close, alert to sounds beneath the surface that did not carry through the air. At night, it slept lightly, rising at small movements outside. By the 5th day of constant rain, the settlement moved more slowly. Tasks were shortened, and travel beyond the valley paused altogether. People watched one another for signs of alarm, but found none decisive enough to follow. Each household waited for clearer proof. The river continued to lose its edges. It moved into places it had not reached in years, not with urgency, but with inevitability. The land accepted the water without resistance, yielding foot by foot. Above it all, the rain fell on, unbroken, as the valley entered a period of quiet imbalance. Darkness fell with the rain still heavy on the valley. By evening, the river had expanded beyond its usual line, pressing into fields and low paths that had remained dry for decades. Water lapped at foundations of cabins nearest its banks, seeping steadily through floorboards and under doors. The sound was quiet yet persistent, a constant reminder that the land had changed. Thomas Hale moved along the trench, observing how water flowed through the channel he had dug. Each curve and slope directed runoff away from the cabin, preventing immediate damage to walls and foundation. He adjusted sections where the water began to rise too quickly, patting down the edges to maintain their form. Mud clung to his boots, and his sleeves were soaked to the elbows. Neighbors were not so fortunate. One man ran from corner to corner in his cabin, lifting furniture and laying planks beneath doorways. Another carried barrels of seed and small tools onto benches and tables, stacking items higher to keep them dry. Their movements were swift and deliberate, driven by necessity rather than panic. If this detailed look into survival resonates, please like, share, and subscribe to follow more accounts like this. The elderly resident from earlier in the week remained in her small cabin, using wooden blocks to lift what few possessions she could move. She spoke little, giving simple instructions to a granddaughter who assisted her. Dialogue throughout the valley was functional, clipped, and focused solely on maintaining dryness or moving livestock to slightly higher ground. Outside, the dog followed Thomas closely, stepping cautiously on saturated soil. It paused often, lowering its head to sniff the rising mud, ears pricked toward the slow movement of water in nearby ditches. Its presence was steady but alert, noticing changes the human eye might overlook. Rain continued into the night without interruption. The river pressed farther into low areas, reaching cabins that had not been touched in years. Shallow currents moved beneath floors and through thin walls, weakening support beams and saturating the ground beneath structures. Trees at the edges of fields leaned slightly, their roots loosened by excess water. By midnight, the valley resembled a shallow lake, with pockets of dry ground where trenches, embankments, or natural rises had offered protection. Thomas's cabin remained dry inside, the trench carrying water around rather than into it. All other homes showed varying degrees of intrusion, depending on their location and elevation. The settlers worked quietly through the hours. No one raised their voice more than necessary. Each action was methodical, moving, lifting, adjusting, and observing. The work required stamina and patience, and sleep came in short periods whenever the flow allowed a moment of rest. At dawn, the rain persisted, but the trench had proved its purpose. Water that would have entered Thomas's cabin had been diverted. Outside, the valley bore signs of pressure and strain, a silent record of what had passed through. Those who had survived the night now waited for daylight to measure the full extent of the flood. Dawn arrived to a valley profoundly altered. The rain had ceased, leaving behind pools of water that reflected the pale sky. Paths were submerged, and areas once dry were coated with a layer of silt and mud. Fences lay twisted or partially submerged, and the lower fields carried remnants of crops stripped away by the persistent water. Livestock had been driven to higher ground or sheltered where possible, their hooves muddy and uneven as they moved among what remained of pastures. Thomas Hale emerged from his cabin at first light. The trench around the structure showed signs of erosion where water had flowed fastest, yet it had held, guiding the majority of runoff away from walls and foundation. The cabin itself stood firm, untouched by the flood that had penetrated so many neighboring homes. His boots sank into the soft earth at the edge of the trench, the mud cooling against his legs as he surveyed the scene. Neighbors moved quietly through the affected areas. One man lifted boards to drain water from his cellar. Another gathered displaced animals and corralled them on slightly higher ground. Dialogue was minimal, functional, and without commentary on the cause or any praise. Their concern remained practical salvage, movement, and protection of what could still be saved. The elderly woman watched from her doorway, her granddaughter assisting her in retrieving small belongings from the shallow pools that had entered the cabin. Neither spoke of Thomas or the trench. Evidence of its effectiveness was visible in the contrast. Where his cabin remained dry, others had mud and water in varying degrees throughout their living spaces. Observation alone sufficed. Words were unnecessary. The dog that had accompanied Thomas during the previous days now moved along the trench, inspecting the wet soil and cautiously stepping where footing was uncertain. Its alertness remained steady, a quiet acknowledgement of the unseen movement of water beneath the surface and the value of the channel that had guided it. Across the valley, subtle signs marked the flood's passage. Trees along the riverbank leaned under saturated soil. Posts and small structures were displaced, revealing the persistent force of water even when it appeared calm. Pools remained where the land had depressions, recording the flow in miniature mirrors of the sky. By mid-morning, the settlement had begun to assess the full extent of the flood. Crops lost, debris collected, and animals accounted for all became measures of impact rather than discussion of cause. Thomas continued to maintain the trench, removing small blockages and smoothing its edges. The valley, now quiet, reflected the weight of water past and the lessons imprinted upon its surface. No praise or vindication was spoken. The evidence stood in the condition of the land and structures themselves. The work of one 19-year-old settler had preserved his home without announcement or ceremony. The valley, altered and quiet, held its record in plain sight. By mid-morning, survivors had begun moving through the valley in measured steps. Each carried tools or supplies in silence, assisting neighbors as necessary. Muddy paths were negotiated carefully, and anyone able to lift boards or move debris did so without comment. Actions spoke of practicality rather than pride or recognition. Communication was limited to short, functional statements. Step here, lift the post, or watch the footing. Thomas Hale continued inspecting the trench around his cabin. The channel had held most of the water, but small adjustments were required where erosion had slightly altered the flow. He worked methodically, shaping the sides and clearing minor blockages. His hands bore scratches and mud, yet the labor proceeded at a deliberate pace, without haste or fanfare. The trench now carried runoff steadily, a controlled path through a valley still wet from the flood. The older authority figure walked past, eyes on the trench rather than the settler. He spoke only briefly, his voice even. "It held," he said, acknowledging the function of the channel without embellishment or ceremony. Thomas nodded, but did not respond beyond the subtle gesture. The work itself was its own statement. Observation confirmed what words could not alter. The elderly resident was guided towards slightly higher ground. Her granddaughter assisted her with each step over saturated soil, careful not to slip. They paused at intervals, ensuring footing and adjusting clothing that had become damp. Once settled, she took note of how water had been redirected around the cabin, marking it mentally for reference in future storms. No conversation unfolded beyond these functional observations. Neighbors moved among the valley, adjusting fences, inspecting fields, and tending to livestock. Horses and cattle were guided back to partially restored pastures, while sheep were rounded to drier enclosures. Each household operated independently, yet mirrored the actions of others, reflecting shared understanding of the flood's impact without need for discussion or direction. Thomas surveyed the broader scene from his cabin's edge. The valley remained quiet, punctuated only by the shifting of water in temporary channels, the sound of animals moving, and distant footsteps on mud-saturated paths. Evidence of the night's work was everywhere: flattened crops, displaced boards, and watermarks along walls. The trench stood as a subtle line of order in a landscape otherwise marked by recent disruption. By late morning, the valley had settled into a pattern of recovery. Movement remained purposeful, silent, and restrained. No words of praise were offered to Thomas, and none were expected. The evidence of his foresight existed plainly in the preserved cabin and the flow of water that continued to be directed away from it. The settlement worked with calm persistence, attending to the aftermath of a flood that had challenged both land and people. Decades had passed since the flood that had tested the valley. A man now advanced in years, once a boy during that spring, recalled the event as a quiet turning point. Settlers and newcomers alike had rebuilt, placing cabins on slightly raised ground or incorporating subtle channels and drains to divert water. The habits of construction shifted slowly, guided not by instruction but by observation of what had endured and what had not. The original trench dug by Thomas Hale had long since disappeared, reclaimed by soil and vegetation, yet its memory persisted in practical measures adopted by subsequent generations. Builders observed natural runoff and adjusted foundations to accommodate it. Doors and thresholds were raised, slight embankments formed, and small ditches carved to protect living spaces from water that might rise unpredictably. These measures were integrated into routine practices rather than announced as innovations. Thomas himself had moved on from the valley, leaving his cabin to the land, but his name endured in accounts shared quietly among settlers. When flood season approached, families recalled how one young man's foresight had guided water away, preserving life and structure. The story was told sparingly, without embellishment, often recounted simply as fact. The land could be managed if careful attention was paid to its flow. Fields, once devastated by the flood, now showed subtle patterns of grading, guiding water toward natural drains and away from homes. Livestock enclosures had been repositioned to higher patches of land, and paths were laid with a gentle rise to prevent ponding. Even small elements, such as barrels or storage sheds, were placed with awareness of potential water movement, reflecting lessons absorbed over time. The river itself remained unchanged, indifferent to human planning. Its course persisted, unaffected by memory or caution. Yet the settlers had adapted to its presence. They worked with observation, patience, and methodical adjustments, integrating these behaviors into seasonal preparations. Each spring brought vigilance, but not fear, guided by understanding born from experience. Legacy witnesses walking the valley decades later could still trace evidence of those early lessons in embankments, slight channels, and elevated cabin foundations. Conversation remained minimal. The land demonstrated its lessons clearly. Observers required no persuasion, only attention to the traces of past floods and the effectiveness of prior methods. By evening, the river's slow current reflected the sky, calm yet persistent. Settlers moved through the valley in routine ways, adjusting where necessary, yet aware that the forces of water would always be impartial. The valley had learned to live with the river rather than attempt to dominate it. A quiet balance maintained through observation and careful adaptation. Thomas Hale's trench was gone, but its influence lingered in every practical measure, now taken without ceremony or comment. If this story of quiet preparation and survival resonates, please like, share, and subscribe to follow more historical accounts from the frontier.